Cryan. I'm Kathy Cryan Hicks, and I'm one of the founding members of Chelmsford Climate Action Team. And I see the several other founding members are here also. And we are very happy to have you all here. We've been holding programs every month. We do a Thursday afternoon climate conversation on the second Thursday at 1 o'clock. If you haven't been to one of those, please check out the calendar on the library's website. The library is our co-sponsor. And can you all hear me okay? So I do want to thank Jessica, who's been here helping us through all of our programs. And also the library has been allowing us, because they're our co-sponsor, to use their Zoom and they handle all the registrations through the library's calendar. And every once in a while we have a special evening program, and tonight's program with Tim Cronin is one of those special Thursday evening programs. And I also want to just say a couple of things. If you're not familiar with the Chelmsford Climate Action Team, please check out our website. It's chelmsfordclimate.org. And the other thing I should mention is if you have any questions or comments, you can put them in the chat while Tim is doing his presentation. It'll help us save some time at the end, because the library does close up at 8:30. And even though we're on Zoom, those folks need to get home. So just wanted to mention that. So tonight's program is Massachusetts' new state climate law and what it could mean for our community. And whether you're from Chelmsford or Westford or Billerica or whatever other towns, I'd love to find out where you're all from. If you want to put in your name and or your town in the chat, it would just be interesting for us to know how far out we stretch, and Tim would get an idea also what our reach is. So please feel free to do that. But I don't know, you're probably all familiar that with the news that Governor Charlie Baker signed a comprehensive climate change legislation back in March, and it commits our state to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and furthers the state's efforts to combat climate change and protect vulnerable communities. And you can go on the mass.gov to find more information on that. But I'm hoping that tonight you'll have all the information that you'll need from our guest. Our speaker tonight is Tim Cronin. He's State Director for Climate Exchange, and he leads their advocacy, policy, and coalitions work here in Massachusetts. He also tracks climate legislation and supports state research deployment. He's also the co-author of the Mass Climate Roundup, a weekly e-newsletter that features analysis on climate, clean energy, and environmental policy in Massachusetts. Previously, Tim worked as the policy and partnership manager for the Climate Action Business Association. He's also served as the co-chair of the Metro Common Scenario Advisory Committee, which helped to develop the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, MAPC, 2050 Boston Regional Plan. Tim has a BA in economics from Stonehill College, and he studied during his undergraduate years at St. Catherine's College in Oxford University. And he adds on his bio, he's a proud lifelong resident of Weymouth, Massachusetts. And I want to thank him for giving us his time tonight. When we thought about who can come and talk about this new climate law, we thought of him first. So I'm gonna hand over the co-hosting duties now to you, Tim. Got it?
Yeah. Thank you, Kathy, for the introduction and for having me here today. Thank you, everyone, for being here too. I think of this last year and a half, we're definitely all pretty zoomed out. So the fact that you're at another Zoom call shows your dedication, I think, to this issue and learning more about it. Before jumping in, I have a cat and my partner's not here right now. Would have had her leave, so she might make some noise. I apologize if that's the case. Thank you as well to Dave. Dave made the connection to have me come on and has been really active in a number of different ways. Thank you, Dave, and Jess and everyone at the library as well. Librarians are in many ways one of the many frontline workers in this pandemic, and nothing but respect for librarians. As you know, I like books. So thank you, Jess. Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully this will work. I think after all this time, we figured this out, but so I share this. Folks should be able to see this, correct?
Yes.
Should be full screen.
Move it.
Okay.
Perfect.
Awesome. Yeah. So again, if folks have any questions, feel free to kind of save them to the end, especially if they're long and take a while to type, or to type them into the chat. So again, my name is Tim Cronin. I'm State Director in Massachusetts for Climate Exchange. What I'm really interested in talking about today, and we're talking with everyone here, is about Massachusetts' new climate law, and specifically kind of where we go from here. I'll probably dive a little bit more into the law and then the different things there. And there's plenty of things that you can do from here, as you probably know. And we'll talk about that a little bit at the end too. So a little bit about Climate Exchange first. We're a Boston-based, Boston-founded national nonprofit. We're pretty young, actually. We're only 7 years old. And we do a lot of work around research and advocacy and communications as well. One of the things that I do a lot of work of is kind of tracking and publishing different analysis on climate policy in the state. If you're interested in learning more about that, it's all kind of free and open to the public. I think Kathy just put a link there, so it's even better. Thanks for that. I also help co-facilitate the Green Future Now campaign, which I'll probably talk a little bit about later, kind of expanding the scope of environmental justice legislation as well as carbon pricing. But what we're here to talk about is a next generation roadmap law. And I think I'll preamble it, we have this date thing here we'll talk about in a second with, Massachusetts has really started to transition towards, in a legislative sense, taking the issue of climate change and clean energy very, very seriously. For context, a lot of different issues, whether it's healthcare financing or public schools or whatnot, are big issues that are usually dealt with every legislative session. And a legislative session is about 2 years. The thing is that there's plenty of other issues that are dealt with every 5 years or 10 years. And in the past, climate was kind of like that. Way back when, in 2008, which isn't that long ago, we actually passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, which focused on and established our first climate goals as a state. And then, there was kind of haphazard bills here and there. And around 2018, we started to cycle where we've been passing bills essentially every session. We had a bill in 2018. Actually, we had one in 2016. That's when the cycle started. One in 2016, another one in 2018. And those are two kind of very small bills. And then in 2020, we passed a next gen bill. Now, this thing was definitely the biggest change in our law since that 2008 bill. And as you can see here on the right, a lot of different things had to happen to get this there. Go back to January of 2020, right before the pandemic, and the Senate took a pretty unprecedented step, actually under Senator Barrett's leadership, who I think represents Chelmsford as well, and some of the other surrounding towns I think folks are from. And the Senate passed a bill, and then the House passed a bill in July, a little bit later during the pandemic, which is also shocking because it was not known that they would be able to pass a bill like that. Then we had this weird thing where from July to January, we were in this limbo where no one passed a bill for a while. And actually, so much so that they passed this bill in January 4th, as you can see here, which is just days, if not the day before the legislative session ended. So usually, you pass a bill before the legislative session ends, and you don't have time for the governor to kind of do anything with it. And that leads to it dying. But in a very unprecedented fashion, what happened with this bill is then, the governor vetoed it after this January 4th deadline. And then that's usually it, it's dead. But in the new session, the House and Senate passed it again, which is very shocking. Usually it's at the end of these 2-year sessions that they start passing bills. So even though the governor vetoed it, even though they kind of waited at the last minute to be able to pass it, they still went forward and put the bill forward again. And whatnot. And the governor vetoed it again, and then sent it back with amendments. And the House and Senate were like, no way, we're going to put it forward one more time. Sent to the governor. Finally, March of this year, which it seems like a year ago, just in pandemic time, the governor signed this bill into law with a few changes here and there. And this bill is very expensive. It not only includes this first thing here of updating our state's climate goals from our 2008 goals, which in and of itself is pretty memorable, but includes a number of other things. I think in recognition of the breadth of the climate crisis, I think that all of us know quite a lot about. Everything from environmental justice to building emissions to energy efficiency standards in a number of different ways, and a bunch more, as you can see in the corner. I'm trying to be dramatic. So I'll probably talk a little bit about some of these things here because they're all worth talking about. So this is the big thing. This is the thing that I think has been kind of, actually it's in the name, the Next Generation Roadmap Bill. It is setting out new goals for the state to meet to achieve kind of emissions reductions. So the first was, what it did is it codified or made into state law a goal of net zero by 2050. It's notable that Governor Baker actually put forward net zero by 2050 as an administrative or an executive order, but any future governor could have undone that. So what the legislature did was said, we're going to have 2050, it's going to be the law of the lands, and that will be how that is. Apologies, I have a train going by. Infrastructure, good stuff, I guess. So, what the goal there was to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. It's worth noting this is not zero emissions, and this is a controversial point at times, because what that can include is getting as close as possible, 98% emissions reductions, let's say, and the final 2% would be made up by offsets, planting trees or sucking carbon out of the atmosphere in some other way. And so, there's some controversy about whether or not that's true emissions reduction. There's concerns that, but if we only get 90% of the way and that other 10% offsets are a very kind of controversial thing as it is, because of a number of things. If people are interested, we can talk about that. But nonetheless, gets us to net zero by 2050, which is consistent with the Paris climate goals. But the thing is that some of the ways that it tries to make and measure and parse that is notable as well. So one is that it sets these 5-year climate goals. In addition to, one of the big things I remember when I was first starting this space that we were talking about was, well, we need to get goals for 2030 and 2040. We can't just have this one big goal at the end. We need to have these steps to get to. Well, we didn't just do those 10-year goals. We ended up doing 5-year goals. And on top of that, we also divided it by sector. So, the transportation sector every 5 years has an emissions goal. That's different from the electric sector. That's different from kind of heating, cooling, and so forth. You can see all the different types of goals there. And that was actually very controversial initially with the governor to have these sector by sector sublimits, as they're called. But in the end, there was a compromise around them. If the state isn't meeting its 5-year goals, and these sublimits come into play, but if the kind of overall goal that they feed into is met, then that's okay. So that was the compromise in the end. The other thing that's really notable as well, we're going to touch base on, especially when we talk about implementation, is the roadmap planning process. So what it does is, and then the roadmap part of this bill comes into play here, is every 5 years for each goal and sublimit, there has to be a plan that the state that publishes and works on a number of stakeholders, internal and external, explaining how the state will get there, how the state will achieve its 2035 goal all the way to its 2050 goal. And the last thing there, and this is pretty innovative as well, is that it recognizes that there are different ways to get here, and a lot of them really rely on new technology. And the state ends up creating these benchmarks of different goals it wants to reach from a legal perspective for EV charging station or electric vehicles, or things like anaerobic digestion, which are the use of like farm refuse or so forth, and the kind of byproducts of that, including methane and other things. I'm an expert on that, in order to create energy and capture the energy from that. So different energy benchmark or technology benchmarks try to get there as well. So all of that in total, again, is a pretty big thing, but we have more going on. And one of the other big things that happened was around environmental justice. I think last year, especially in 2020, the environmental community and a lot of people working on this really started to recognize, I think more so than in the past, that centering environmental justice in all of these conversations was critical. A lot of communities, are historically overburdened with fossil fuel infrastructure. I speak from Weymouth, where in parts of North Weymouth, which are environmental justice communities, and bordering Quincy, have been seeing lots of fossil fuel infrastructure, things that have decreased the air quality of those areas. And it is in recognition of that, and then also that some of the front lines when it comes to impacts of droughts, of heat, of rising seas, of increased flooding, are oftentimes in the most vulnerable communities and often low-income communities. And so what the state did, and when there's this big effort and the House ended up passing it, and then it was included in the Senate version at the end, was having our first legal definition of what environmental justice is, because you can't solve an issue unless you know what it is. And the criteria include, income, race, but also English language proficiency as well. And so on any of those metrics, in areas that are lower income than state average by a certain amount, essentially kind of considered under the poverty line, and a few other things with the other ones, individuals in those census tracts in those areas of a town, not just the whole town, but the areas in a town, would be considered in an environmental justice community. And that helps to identify how different policies are impacting those communities, and allows for policy to reference this definition in the future in order to help to kind of support environmental justice communities. And just for reference to, I think the most recent definition that's come out from this bill, it shows about 45% of the state of Massachusetts is in an environmental justice community. And I can try to pull up the correct percentage there at some point, but it's a pretty big number, because across those different ways, some communities have all three of income, race, and English language proficiency. Some just have one, but nonetheless, there's quite a few communities and sub-areas and communities that are counted as that. Another thing as well, we have this Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which is really important too for representation. One of the other things too is it kind of broadened the scope of what's considered an impact from an existing source of pollution, and included, for example, when you're citing an energy facility or whatnot, you don't just consider, this energy facility, this compressor station or whatnot, it's going to create this much air pollution, but how much air pollution is there already in that area? And if you add to this, is it going to bring it over a dangerous amount, because there's also next to it another compressor station that's been there for 30 years. So considerations like that. And this was a big fight. This wasn't even included in the original House bill. It had to be added as an amendment. There's a lot of really good work that groups like CLF and a number of others, East, Green Roots, kind of going on, had done to get this there. Now, I've kind of run through some of these here. There's a number of other things as well, energy related. One of them was this establishing of what are called stretch codes, which are kind of higher standards for new buildings that local communities like Chelmsford or Weymouth or anyone else can adopt, that is above the state's existing building code when it comes to energy efficiency. When you build a building, a new building, whether it's residential or commercial, there's certain standards they have to meet, and these are based in large part off of state standards, state model standards that are based off national ones and so forth. But states have a certain amount of leeway, and what this would do is it would create a new standard that the state would adopt, where there'd be the standard that a community like Chelmsford could voluntarily join, and then therefore all communities, all buildings that are built in that community would have, in this case, be required to be net zero, which means that the amount of carbon pollution or emissions they create is net zero. So sure, and that can be done in a few ways. One's by being energy efficient, having better insulation, having heat pumps and so forth. And of course, every building will produce some energy. And so the other way to make that net zero is to put some solar, let's say, or other kind of renewables involved with the construction. This was very controversial, I think, among some home builders, but in the end, it is voluntary. It actually hasn't been established yet. Kind of the process was set by this bill. We're going to get to a point where we have these net energy stretch codes, and then communities can opt into them. We can talk about the timeline later. The other thing here is that it starts to nudge. I'm going to say the word nudge because it doesn't really push us all the way towards the renewables, but it definitely expanded the ability and the power for the state to compel our utilities to have offshore wind. It's part compelling, part allowing utilities to do so. So they used to be able to have 3,200 megawatts, that offshore wind that's going off just south of the Cape and Islands. Now we can have up to 5,600 megawatts, which I can't remember off the top of my head how many kind of houses that is, but it's significant. And I think, like a lot of things, it's shown that those costs of those projects are a lot lower than fossil fuel costs in terms of projects, and also come in saving consumers a lot of money. Um, and the other thing is that it increases what's called the Renewal portfolio standard. So all the electrons that are being used right now to get us watching this Zoom and these lights on or whatnot are combined, are powered by a mix of a number of different things, including renewables. And there's a certain standard for utilities to be able to purchase renewables. If they don't hit that, they pay a fee, and that fee goes towards creating more renewables. So regardless, there's to some extent increased renewables, the higher this percentage requirement is. And so the percentage is actually going to increase a little bit faster. So much so that we'll get to 40% RPS is what it's called by 2030, which is another kind of big thing. That's a great incentive, because if utilities are incentivized to have renewables, then they have the incentive to kind of purchase them and create additional incentives for individuals to get them and so forth. So it's kind of creating demand for renewables, through government in this sense, in order to get more renewables overall, and not just rely on people just, doing it on their own in the markets. The other thing is, our utility regulators, our gas regulators didn't consider climate before. Now they're required to. They have to not only consider climate, but equity as well. And also security was another thing in there. I mean, we saw some of the natural gas security breaches that have happened recently. I think that's fed into that concern. Another thing, and this is a really weird thing, but Massachusetts, we did not have updated or modernized appliance efficiency standards. So everything from washers and dryers to the type of spouts that are used in your house and so forth, we're actually at a much lower standard. And now we actually just adopted California's. And this is a weird one, but actually it's expected to save consumers and businesses about $282 million a year. And part of this is that it lets us and puts us into one of a few markets in the country around this. So when we buy a washer or dryer, we're either buying one that you could buy the same one here as in Texas, let's say, or you can buy the same one here as in California. And the California ones are generally more energy efficient. And by us upgrading our appliance standards to California's, what it means is that we're better able to access that part of the kind of national market for appliances. So it doesn't really do much except for getting us to that part and then saving us money in that sense. There's no cost involved. It's probably very minimal. Honestly, probably the cost things when it comes to appliances is more the supply chain issues we've seen with COVID. And this is, not likely. I think that's the biggest thing overall. But when you eventually do get your washer or dryer, it's going to be more energy efficient and save us more money and water, frankly. And then also included, similar to the gases on mass save, to have climate in there. And of course, there's a lot of other things. This was a massive bill. It was over 100 pages long with just as many sections, included a number of things, money for mass use, for workforce development, for minority and women-owned businesses, some other solar stuff here and there. Not to discount any of these things is important, but actually I think one here that might be impactful to y'all is new gas safety requirements. The first time in a long time that we've had those updated, and a lot of that's in response to the Merrimack Valley kind of gas disaster that happened. I think it was 3 years ago at this point, maybe more. So there's a lot in there, and so we have that bill. It passed, but like any piece of legislation, it needs to be implemented broadly, and that can be a few things. It's oversight and making sure the governor and everyone else who's been directed to do things by legislation is actually doing them and meeting their appropriate deadlines. It's also about updating, iterating the law. The world that this bill was put into when it was passed is different than how it was a month later, or even in this case, a few months later. And 5-10 years down the road, the energy markets will be different. The impacts of different policies within this will be different, and the intended needs, the intended goals will be shaped and changed by that, just as much as the intended need is there. Maybe in the future, the federal government gives us a lot of money in there, which we don't have to put money into this thing, but we need to put in this thing. And so we need to iterate and update that law, usually through legislation, passing more bills to kind of tweak things here and there. And the third thing, and this is the biggest one, is funding. And we really need to find the money to pay for a lot of these goals, because what you'll notice in all that thing I said is that none of that talks about how we find money for anything there. We set these goals as a state and we say, we're going to reach net zero by 2050 and all these other goals. We're going to get these technology benchmarks and so forth. We're going to tweak a few things here and there, help utilities get a little cleaner, make sure we define environmental justice so we can work on it and so forth. But nowhere in that does it talk about increasing funding for different things. And it's not the case that, because this bill never promised that, never said it was going to, but it's important, as climate activists, as people in the Commonwealth who want to care about this, that we find and make sure we direct funding from a multitude of sources towards this legislation. Because if we don't have heat pumps, if we don't have solar, if we're not investing in EV transport or kind of modern transportation, we can't get to those climate goals. And having it on paper is not the same as doing it. It is important because it helps us get and guide there, and that's important, but still a lot of things involved there. So when you talk about the first one, this is just a few of them. There's so many different aspects to this, and even dates have to be created, and there's dates to create dates and so forth. But essentially what the first part of that implementation of kind of making sure the new law is overseen and the oversight is done on that is just making sure the governor at the executive branch is acting in the spirit and the letter of the law. With a bill 100 and over 100 pages long, there's always a conflict, even within the bill, within state law. And where that conflict exists, there's always ambiguity over how to implement it or whatnot. And the courts can do some of this. Frankly, I'm sure there's groups like CLF or other groups, the Conservation Law Foundation, the CLF, for those who may not know, that may sue and kind of compel the state to do certain things. But just as important is the legislature and honestly us advocates understanding what this law is and what it's supposed to be doing, and making sure that all the regulations it says to make or promulgate, as the fancy word is, are done, and making sure that it's implemented properly. So we've already gone through a lot of these things here. I mean, we're starting on some of those building regulations there. I think one of the things that's coming up is in July of 2022, we have to start setting those emissions goals for 2025. We have to set those, what's our 2025 emission, and make sure that kind of eventually gets us to 2050. And then inside of that, create that roadmap that I mentioned before of how are we going to hit that. And then another kind of big goal is a year or so from now, in December of 2022, we have to get that net zero stretch building codes done and so forth. And so, you can imagine a world where individuals who don't want to see the stretch code to be as ambitious as maybe we wanted it to be when we passed this bill would try to undermine it and make the codes less ambitious. So if towns and cities want to go and say, hey, I want to adopt that stretch code, I want to get net zero. Oh, well, they can't legally do that because the stretch code doesn't exist or doesn't exist to the level that they thought it was. So that's where the importance of implementation comes in. Another thing there, updating and iterating, this is again through legislation. There's a few things that are there, environmental justice, again, really touch base within that bill. No way do we solve the issues of environmental justice or get us to equity when it comes to a lot of the issues that EJ communities are mentioning in the bill. So, there's some bills out there that allow for, local communities to sue like a town or whatnot, or more so the state if, a policy decision impacts them disproportionately. There's things like making sure there's air monitoring in communities and making sure that indoor and outdoor air quality, not just in EJ communities, but everywhere, is kind of protected and kind of invested in. There's more emissions reductions. There's a lot of movement to get heat pumps adoptions, get 1 million heat pumps or so forth. And that's something that's not in the bill, but it's something that's going to be focused on. And then another one I talked about before is there's another bill, 100% renewable energy, out there that's trying to get us to 100% renewable energy portfolio by 2035. Try to get there really quick. This bill doesn't even touch that issue. It obviously increased it a little bit, but that's another thing too. And the thing that I talk about a lot is funding. And I think some of this I mentioned before, but if we're going to be getting to those stretch codes, if we're going to get to our 2030, 2050 goals, if we're going to get solar, offshore wind storage, and all that kind of fun stuff when it comes to transportation, heating reductions, we need to pay for it in some way. And there's a bunch of ways we can do that. One of the ways that Climate Exchange has really done a lot of work kind of examining this issue is getting to an economy-wide carbon price, essentially closing this polluter loophole that exists. Because the issue is right now is that in the state, we have a few different sectors. We have the electric sector, which produces emissions. We have the transportation sector, which produces emissions. We have the heating sector. We have a few other small ones there, like agriculture, which is just really small. But these other ones are big. And in the electric sector, we actually do have a carbon price right now. It's a very low one. It's called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. And it essentially puts a small fee that's decided by the market onto importers of fossil fuels into the states. And that fee is meant to fully account for the cost of those fuels, not just to extract it and ship it to Massachusetts, but once it's burned, its impact on our communities. So in air pollution across the state, in the impacts of climate change that eventually do impact our state as well. And so the idea of using a carbon price as a way to properly price fossil fuels, not just at the low price that they've been traditionally kind of given to everyone, is a way to better align markets and that cost with the actual impact of fossil fuels. And so we only really currently have a carbon price on the electric sector. We're trying to get to one on the transportation sector. I think folks may have heard about the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCI, which Governor Baker has been a really strong champion of, and a number of other folks as well. That would get us another one on transportation, but we don't have anyone being considered right now on heating fuels or whatnot. And so, by closing that loophole of heating fuels that come into the state are not covered by a carbon price, by doing that, we can actually raise quite a bit of money, not just for infrastructure, but also that having that price itself helps to disincentivize the use of fossil fuels by these importers as well. That is by no means the only way to raise money. One is also through bonding. Bonding is a pretty tried and true practice at state and local levels. It's used to be able to reasonably raise money, above kind of a balanced budget to spend on public infrastructure or whatnot, and redirecting some of that money towards climate mitigation projects like solar and offshore wind and stuff like that is a viable option that other states have looked at, and hasn't really gained a lot of traction yet in Massachusetts, but is a good way to get some of those infrastructure projects that we've done. And the other one, and this is the big one everyone's talking about, is the federal stimulus money. We have ARPA money, which has already come through. It's actually highly restrictive. So that is the American Rescue Plan. State legislature right now is trying to figure out exactly how they want to spend it, and whether they want to spend it this year or over the next 5 or so forth. But the key thing to note with that is it's highly restricted. So for example, you can't just spend it on anything. The closest you can get is making sure that the money that's spent on the things that the federal government said that you had to. Okay, I'm just gonna close the door. My cat left. Yeah, so the closest you can get to that is, let's say we have a school building, and the ARPA money says, hey, you can use this money to make sure that the filtration system in schools is better. And that's in large part in response to COVID. Now, what you can do as well is, when you're putting in that HVAC system, you can make sure it allows for better cooling because of the impacts of climate change, because that's impacting schools pretty direly. I mean, I think people probably know from experience, maybe some other individuals on the call as well with young children know that schools don't have AC in the Northeast. And as days become warmer, that's an issue. At the same time, you can make sure that maybe you're using heat pumps. So heat pumps allow for more energy efficient cooling, almost the equivalent of ACs. And so you can use that money in a smart way to reduce energy use, but it's not enough. And I think that's where the rest of the federal dollars come from. And I don't even know where we're at right now with it, between the House and the Senate arguing over it, but the infrastructure bill would be a big game changer in that regard. So the last thing, here, kind of shameless plug on some level, but something worth noting, is there is a bill that tries to deal with that first and second part of the carbon pricing and the green bonding here. And this is, put some information here. I think a bit of a typo because it says the Climate Reality Project. They're one of the endorsers as well. And so we filed this bill in 2021, has about 70 co-sponsors. Again, carbon pricing actually has passed the House, the Senate actually in 2018, 2020, and does a number of different things. I think these two things here are pretty familiar, I think, from the last thing I mentioned. But one of the things the Green Future Act does is raises about $10 billion by 2030, and does so by, again, closing that polluter loophole, another fancy way of saying having a carbon price that covers our whole economy. We also do that green bonding as well, by giving Massachusetts, again, a sensible way to raise money. But the thing that's interesting about it is that what the Green Future Act, it doesn't say this is what you have to spend the money on or anything like that. It says we have this 2050 goal, and what we need to do is get to that goal using infrastructure, using public funding in this regard. So that $10 million there, $10 billion, apologies. And it does it in a few ways. One is it sends money to a fund at the state level called the GIF that puts money towards all the stuff we talked about before, essentially anything that reduces emissions. Another is it sends money back to local cities and towns, allowing cities and towns the ability to decide how money is spent, and does so in a pretty democratic fashion. So I imagine individuals like, let's say this passes, money comes back to Chelmsford. You would have the ability, probably individually here, pretty active in the community, to help shape and in some cases decide how that money is spent. It also includes money for green workforce development, and specifically for displaced fossil fuel workers. I think one of the realities of the shift in the global economy, not just what we do in Massachusetts or what the Green Future Act or anyone does, is that fossil fuel jobs are decreasing with demand decreasing. And I think making sure that individuals who are employed in the fossil fuel industry and the families that rely on that income have a buffer in case their jobs are not there tomorrow. So it's making sure that there's some ability not only to protect fossil fuel workers in the short run, but also make sure that in the long run they can, especially if they're not near retirement age or they can continue to work or want to work, to be able to move towards new jobs in Massachusetts, because we have a pretty dynamic industry kind of economy, and we can be able to slate people into well-paying jobs in a number of areas. And the last thing that the Green Future Act specifically does is includes these things called household dividends. Again, recognizing that the shift in the global economy away from fossil fuels can cause not only fossil fuel jobs to leave, but also increases in utility costs. So those on fixed incomes, those who are on the lower income side of the spectrum, can't buy a Tesla or buy a new house that's closer to a commuter, the MBTA or a commuter rail stop. And so some of the impacts of, let's say, putting a carbon price on would be borne by individuals on the lower side of the income spectrum, but can be then solved by having a dividend where essentially payments are made back of the cost that they would have had otherwise. And that's a pretty common thing that was included in a number of the bills that were passed in the past. And some big benefits of this, and this is where climate exchange really comes in, because we can model this, is we actually found that in this year says 80,000, we actually found it was 83,700 jobs would be created by this. And those jobs come in part because you're investing in green infrastructure in the state, which is a big job creator overall. Everything from heat pump installation to installing solar, to some of the support that comes with it. That's about half the jobs. The other half of the jobs actually come in large part from energy savings. So we actually found that over the course of the next 7 years, if it was passed and implemented in 2023 and kind of through 2030, that there'd be $17 billion in cumulative benefits to Massachusetts. And some of that includes health benefits of not, getting asthma or so forth from having cleaner air because using less fossil fuels. But some of that is because we're not sending tons of money out of state anymore to pay for fossil fuels, that then that money's invested somewhere else, usually out of the country. Instead, what we're doing is we're investing that back in here. So if I am saving money, not paying for fossil fuels, I'm going to probably spend it at the coffee shop down the street or the bookshop or something. And sure, not all of the money would, but more than there would be otherwise. And that in and of itself creates and increases the overall level of economic activity in the state, which creates jobs. So that's the one thing. I mean, that's not just the Green Future Act, that's a lot of different bills and legislation. If you're investing in clean energy, you're saving people money, and that money goes back into the economy and creates jobs, especially in a state like Mass. Another thing, and this is central to this legislation, I think, again, to that point of environmental justice being central, is this actually invests about 60% of green infrastructure spending in EJ communities across the state. And obviously that can have benefits beyond it. It creates jobs everywhere and so forth. But is recognition that, oftentimes if you look at all the green infrastructure that's out there, oftentimes less of it is in environmental justice communities than not. And then that last point there, I think, is something that, again, some of the benefits of this beyond just creating jobs and helping our economy is saving lives, not just from air pollution, from not having, making sure that we're not hitting the worst case scenario when it comes to climate change, but helping the best we can to reduce that. There's a lot of cost breakdowns here I won't get into. I think the question, what can people do? I can share a little link here about different stuff. I think folks know, right? You have 4 different state reps who represents you here. You can kind of reach out to them and let them know, hey, I'd like the Green Future Act, or even just say, hey, I think climate funding is important. I think we got to do more of that. You can also phone bank with us. We do a lot of phone banking. I can share some stuff in the chat about that. Another thing too, writing in support of op-ed or an LT in the paper. If you see something about climate change that's written in the Lowell Sun, or I think it's the Chelmsford Eagle, the Eagle Independent, I think it was. I think that's another paper in this area. Apologies, I'm from the South Shore. If you see like something written about it, respond to it. Maybe say something about climate funding or do an op-ed or whatnot. Always happy to help with stuff like that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now because I want to share something. And I think what I'm going to do first is start to go through some of the questions I see in the chat.
Yeah, there's some there.
Yeah, I see some good questions there so far, and I'm sure other people have more complex questions that they would like to ask maybe in real life. So let's look at a few of them. So yeah, so Tom asked, what in-state green bonds can we buy now? So I'm not 100% sure of that, and part of that is actually because of the relative complexity of the bond market. So I think actually anyone who's tried to buy bonds for a retirement portfolio or something like that knows that you can find like Chelmsford Library bonds, or we just built a school in Weymouth. You can buy bonds in Weymouth that support the library or so forth. So there's a way to do that. I am not an investment advisor, so I don't know much about that. I don't take anything I say as investment advice because it's not. But you can probably find things that you can find there. And I think also there is a small green bond program that the state treasurer had been piloting. So I'm not really sure about that. But what the bonding means more in this context is making sure that the state is putting together as part of its bonding overall, because the state ends up spending about $6 billion a year in bonding. And that goes to things like roads and bridges and schools and so forth. But some of that also goes to kind of climate infrastructure currently, but it's a few $1 million, not $1 billion or so. And so just trying to increase the amount of that existing bonding that goes towards green infrastructure is really what that is. I'll go to the next one. I think Dave Sperry said, how much green energy can be produced in mass? It's a great question. And I don't think anyone has a good answer for that necessarily. And part of that is because the amount of energy you create is a product of not only how many solar panels you have out there, let's say, but how efficient they are. And we've been seeing increasing efficiency of solar, let's say, or offshore wind over these last few decades or so. And so part of it is getting as many, let's say, solar panels on as many roofs as possible, which creates a lot of energy. But if the solar panel you put on is twice as effective as it was 10 years ago, then you've created twice the amount of energy. So there's a lot of, and a great example of this is that, the offshore wind farms back under Governor Deval Patrick that ended up not moving forward. I think it was Cape Wind. I think that was the name of it. Apologies if not. But essentially those offshore wind farms under Governor Patrick are very different than the ones that were introduced more recently, in that they were half the size, the blades, than what they are now. And actually the ones now are so much larger because technology progressed so much, and they actually increase, I think, by 3 times the amount of energy that they produce, just for the same footprint, for the same relative cost. And so, I think Dave's question of how much can be produced in mass, I think in part it's unknown. I think the other thing to note is, we're not going to be able to produce all our energy ourselves. Some of this requires, making sure other states also produce energy, and that we can share it between states. One of the fundamental issues with kind of renewables is that if the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining, unless you're using nuclear or something like that, which is debatable whether that's renewables, you don't have the ability to produce energy. So there's 2 ways to solve that. One is to make sure you're connected to a national grid so that, yeah, the sun's not shining here, but it's shining in California, so we can get energy from there. The other thing is to make sure that you save that energy during the day or during the times when the sun is shining. So that's another way to do it. And so I think is a fair question underlying what Dave's saying of, can we produce all the amount of energy that we want? And I don't know the answer to that, but I know that we're not producing nearly enough now. Tom had another question here. Doesn't carbon pricing mean someone is spending more money? What that question. So you're saying someone is spending more money somewhere else. So a lot of that actually is a lot of the kind of placement of that tax overall, because it is done on individuals and individuals who are not individuals, but companies that are importing fossil fuels to the state. More of that tax burden will be placed on those companies than anyone else. So there would be, and this is just a reality with any carbon price, there would eventually be prices that would be sent down the supply chain to consumers. And that is kind of a reality that exists with anything. It exists with Reggie right now. But there also is not 100% of that would go there. Quite a bit of that actually would be paid by those companies in the form of inefficiencies or whatnot. It's not a one-to-one, place $1 and it goes back to individuals. But that said, most of it does. And the important thing to note here is that what that bill does is includes a green dividend, which ensures that the bottom 40% of people by household income, people on fixed incomes, people who are on the lower income side of the spectrum, receive payment back that's equal to the cost that they would have paid in general. So the 5 cents here and there on gas or so forth adds up into a number that can be easily calculated and then sent back in the form of payment. And that doesn't actually decrease their ability to live in a better place, a bit more of an energy efficient place, or be able to take transportation or whatnot. But it does recognize individuals on the lower income side of the spectrum have less options when it comes to shifting their fossil fuel consumption. And because they have less options, if you didn't give them individuals in that area money back, then it would just be a cost and it'd be a regressive thing, policy, and that's not in anyone's interest. So Linda Holt says, what sector will address the pollution from home lawnmowers and gas-powered landscaping equipment? Yeah, that's a good question. That would primarily, unless you're using electric, which would be electric sector, that would primarily be the transportation sector, because it's kind of fuel in general. I think you use gas for a lawnmower, same as you use gas for a car. I think like a lot of things that would probably end up being the case, that things would shift towards electric overall. And again, in one of those cases where technology has become better and better. I think my grandfather first got his first electric lawnmower maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I think died immediately. It wasn't that great. He actually got a new one recently and it's a lot better. The charge is better on it. Its ability to cut grass is much better. And I'm sure as not just as anything we do in Massachusetts, but as the global economy continues to make fossil fuels more expensive, as it will, because as less fossil fuels and demand is decreasing, as those become more expensive, consumers like us, people who want to create lawnmowers are going to create better lawnmowers that are electric. That's probably the likely there. Dave says, why did Baker keep trying to block the legislation? And now that it's passed, are there any people or organizations who are currently working against its implementation or against the Green Future Act? Yeah, great question. So part of Baker's kind of public reasoning for why he didn't support the next generation roadmap bill, and he vetoed it twice, and we had that back and forth, was concern around the net zero stretch code was one of them, as well as just with some of the specifics of the bill, like the sector by sector sublimits. He just didn't think that was possible to implement, which I think is not necessarily the truth. And a few ways, in my opinion, is that it actually is quite easy to implement. If not easy, then important to do. And eventually they actually then funded a few more positions in the EEA, which is the implementation government agency, so that people could figure out how to do that. The other thing too, there was a well-documented instance where individuals in the real estate industry were opposed to the stretch code. And part of that was concerns over increasing costs for homes, and that would somewhat impact the real estate industry in some sense in Massachusetts. And I think a lot of that drove Baker's initial hesitancy in his vetoing of it. He didn't oppose quite a lot of it, to be honest. He supported publicly a lot of the different parts of the bill. In the end, he ended up signing a bill that was super similar to the one that initially was put forward. But I think a lot of the opponents, his opposition to the initial roadmap bill, came from his concerns that were aligned with the real estate industry. And in terms of, I think, the Green Future Act or other things like that, the Green Future Act is a little bit different in that it doesn't touch a lot of things that the real estate industry we're always concerned about. I think a lot of the opponents so far of the Green Future Act have been multinational fossil fuel companies who I think across the board are not interested in climate action, and then seek to kind of lobby on that at the local level and the state level a lot. We haven't seen a lot of issues there beyond that. I think the other thing too is, like a lot of things, the Green Future Act, its biggest issue, the biggest thing that's going to lead to it to die and let the legislature is inertia. Legislative bodies are by design meant to be slow, methodical, and have tons of places where someone can say no and then they don't move forward. That's what it means, is that you have to build a lot of consensus, both inside the legislature and outside of it, to get anything done. And that I think overall is characterized as just inertia. Things don't move a lot. You put them in the legislation, they take forever to get through. And so we've had this bill sputtering around for a few sessions. We're on the third one now. I'm pretty confident that it could move forward. But you never know what would happen. Maybe they say, we're not doing this time around, or we just can't get just enough people to get through, or something like that. That is the biggest issue, or just inaction on the legislative level. That's always, and it's not just our bill, it's every bill, whether it's veteran affairs or healthcare. To do anything is hard by design in the legislature. And you can ascribe a number of other things to that as well. People not wanting to act on climate and whatnot. And some of that might be true, but it's one of those things where, it's one of those things where it's always difficult to pass bills. Carol says,
I guess what I'm trying to get out of my question is, do you view Baker as an asset or an obstacle to what we're trying to achieve here?
Yeah. It's complicated because Baker has been leading on a number of things, the Transportation Climate Initiative. So he doesn't think that a carbon price is a bad idea in theory. I think his questions is how it's implemented and how the money's spent. I think as long as he's governor, he'd also like to see more power going to the governor when implementing it, as opposed to the legislature. That just is how that usually plays out. I'd say that the other thing to the note from the lessons from the next gen bill overall is that even though the governor had the ability to veto the bill and did so, exercise that power a few times, the legislature always used its Democratic supermajorities to override him. And so if the legislature can get together and agree on something like the Green Future Act, or like the next generation roadmap bill this session, that's usually enough to say, that's great that you don't like that, Governor Baker, but we're going to do it anyway. And so it's complicated because it says, if Governor Baker was an ally, it would probably make things a lot easier, or at least outwardly an ally. But if he's an opponent, as long as we have the legislature on board and we as citizens can convince them to be on board, that's actually generally enough. And then governors come and go. And it's one of those cases where, as long as the legislature and us as citizens continue to care about the roadmap bill or the Green Future Act, if it does pass, that's usually enough to make sure we hold the governor accountable to implement the bill correctly. Does that kind of get to, like, I have found that if I ever try to make predictions of the legislature, I'm always wrong. In the next 5 months, things will change irrevocably.
I'm just trying to decide if I should vote for Baker next time he's up for re-election.
Yeah.
Sounds like it's a complicated.
Yeah. I don't bring personal politics to it too much, but
depends on who's running against him.
Yeah.
It would depend on who's running against him and their policies, I guess.
True. I mean, I feel like there's a few people running now. People have different opinions about climate and so forth. I think some individuals in the climate community have always been divided around it. But other people are very clear that they don't think he's good enough for energy. I will say, as an anecdote, I live in Weymouth. We have the Weymouth natural gas compressor station. We had a lot of difficulty trying to ask Baker to advocate to stop that. It's unnecessary, it's dangerous. He has the ability to stop it, and he has been interested in doing so. And I'll say that and I'll stop. So I think Byrne had a question as well. The state is very far behind the CECP goals for electrification of housing. Yes, that is very true. The Globe article cites 100,000 houses a year electrified. I believe that's heat pumps too, versus 461. So actually, what Bern is talking about specifically is there was a Globe article recently that said the state has a goal of hitting 100,000 heat pump installations a year, but in reality, in the last year, I think it was in 2019, before the pandemic, only 461 were actually installed. And then Bern's question was, what can be done to change this around? And my boss, the executive director of climate change, had an LTE, the Globe, responding to that, because one of the things the Globe mentioned is two reasons that's the case. One is trying to install heat pumps. I think a lot of the cases we lack the technical ability, which goes back to actually Carol's question, which I missed a little bit. So I'll answer it now. We lack a lot of the technical individuals to install heat pumps, and it's one of those things where you can pass bills and whatnot, but in the end of the day, we need people who are actively making sure that high schools and so forth have the ability to have knowledgeable installers on heat pumps, let's say. And so part of the reason that we don't have enough heat pumps is that people don't know how to install them. You can bring a heat pump to someone and they'd say, what the heck is this? So the amount of knowledgeable installers is actually pretty low. The other part of that, though, is cost. Heat pumps are very expensive. And yeah, I don't think all of us go around and change our HVAC system, every year willy-nilly, because it's super expensive. I don't think I could do that in my house here, without selling it or whatnot. And so the issue is that the costs are still so high, and they're so much higher than they could be, or they are to be reachable by consumers. So that's where a lot of the investment comes in. So if a bill like the Green Future Act passed, what it would allow for is part of that, 1.2 billion a year that can go towards green infrastructure can be put towards a program to make the cost of heat pumps lower, or to make sure that we are building heat pumps in Massachusetts that are cheaper or something along those lines. So there's a lot of options there. And I think part of it is the installer active government thing, making sure that we have, again, more technical high schools who can have people who train to have high paying jobs to do that. But the other part of it is definitely the cost. And we need to be able to bring down those costs. I think like a lot of things. I mean, solar is one of those things where the cost of solar in the 80s and the 70s was high. And over time, with public investments, we've been able to bring those costs down, create a market for solar, which helps to then further bring the costs down. And we're at a point now where solar without incentives is sometimes, keyword is sometimes, just as cost competitive as is otherwise, and people can do so. So I think Dave had another question. Chelmsford recently created a committee specifically for the purpose of getting the town to net zero carbon by 2050. That's phenomenal. I commend you on many regards. I've been trying to get a lot of towns to do that. So kudos to Challenge for being able to do that. And I'm sure this group had a ton to do with that. What do you recommend the committee focus on at a town level to help support this legislation's implementation? Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I personally have always really been focused on is giving towns and cities more capacity, more resources to be able to deal with and implement things like a net zero carbon goal by 2050. Right now, I think we have kind of a mishmash of random incentive programs, or the municipal vulnerability program, or green communities, which I'm sure Chelmsford is a green community right now. Yeah, I think I saw a few nods. Different money that can come into a community to do different things. But I think we need a more dedicated either funding formula or otherwise with that. And part of the Green Future Act is actually to have money that can come from the state level in relatively unrestricted aid back to communities. And I think part of it is if you're talking about as a committee, things that you can do beyond just making sure that your houses or your community buildings are energy efficient, making sure that you try to get to electric buses and stuff like that. If you're going to ask for something, it's for more support from the state. I never hear enough from communities across the board, from mayors and select boards who are talking about climate change at the state level, about how they need more support from the state. And as a result, state legislators don't see that as a big issue. They don't see that as a priority to try to say, how do we get more money to communities to do things that they want to do? I think my vision for this kind of stuff is a tide that can lift all ships. So you have communities like Chelmsford that are already kind of moving up ahead with these plans. But you have other communities that, let's say, don't have a plan, but everyone can receive money and then can do better. So that's kind of my vision with that. So I would say, I think the base thing, whether it's the Green Future Act that you asked for or something else, I think it's the question of dedicated funding for communities is important. We have the Community Preservation Act that brings money back to communities, and I don't know if Chelmsford is a CP8 community or not, but something like that, maybe without some of the matching aspects of that, would be really, really useful to consider. So now I don't know how long. I think it's a few people jumped off because it was 8, but I want to open up the floor to, I think, other questions folks may have. I feel like I've talked for an hour because I have, so I'll take like a second to let people talk.
If people want to raise their hand, we have I think a small enough group that I should be able to see everyone. If you just want to wave your hand, or if you prefer to put the little green hand up, if you can find that. I think it's under, where is it?
It's under reactions.
Reactions, okay. There you go. There's the hand, raise the hand. So if somebody has a question, I should be able to call on you and I can see you. Barbara.
Yes, I'm Barbara from Westford, and we're currently working on a roadmap to 2050. My question, which I think I put in the chat, but it really is about the way Mass Save is going to go forward. And I think there's some consternation about how it's not making many changes right now. Tim, I just looked at the rebate schedule. Yes, there are rebates for heat pumps and water heaters and heat pump water regulators, but there's still a substantial amount of rebate available for the oil and the gas. When is that going to diminish? Is there a plan?
Yeah. I mean, that a lot of that has been brought up recently by, there was actually the same Boston Globe reporter who mentioned the heat pump, not having enough heat pumps, recently mentioned that as well, that we have Mass Save and kind of brought that higher to the attention of the radar of everyone, that we have incentives that essentially are paying for additional fossil fuels. And the reason I think this is such a big issue, and probably a lot of people know this anyway, is that when you're paying for a heat pump versus a hot water heater that uses oil, you have that usually for the lifetime of its kind of working life. So that could be 20, that could be 30 years. You bake in those costs there. So if we as a state are continuing to have incentives for fossil fuel based heat, that means those emissions are baked in for 20 or 30 years. So I think it's a terrible problem. I'll say that I think there's nothing weirdly within state law or the next gen bill that says that can't happen. It included within Mass Save that it has to consider climate change and emissions overall in creating program offerings, but it does not say no fossil fuels. So that's something, if that is going to be changed, I don't see that Governor Baker at this time has made any statements about it. I don't think that he's likely to say stop that unilaterally, even though I don't know if he 100% can, because Mass Save is kind of quasi-governmental. Probably the best way to fix that is legislation. And I think I heard a little bit from Senator Baird and I think a few other folks that they were very angry about this. And so I wouldn't be surprised if whatever climate bill moves forward includes something to remove that and shift that money towards heat pumps, let's say. So I'd say that I mean, it's we're in the weird part where we're not filing bills. That was done in January, February. We're not starting to pass bills. We're in that weird in-between time where honestly, you reaching out to your representative and your senator, Barbara, and everyone else is going to have probably the most impact in them saying, oh, that's actually an issue. I'll make sure to try to support that when it comes around. And we're in that weird place where people, if they hear people talk about this issue, it might lead to something, but if they don't hear anything, they're not going to do anything.
Well, that's a very good point, Tim. I think what I saw was favorable, which was that the rebates for heat pumps and water heaters were up front on the list, but the amount of money that's going for the oil and the gas was too much. If they could just come down to very few dollars for those rebates, it might swing things a little bit differently. Thank you.
Yeah. Carol?
Carol, I see your hand up over here. Are you unmuted? No. You need to unmute, Carol. There you go.
Karen,
Yes, I was in a webinar actually with Senator Barrett last night. And the topic of the problems with Mass Save came up. And if I understood him correctly, he stated that Mass Save submits a 3-year, their plan every 3 years. So things take time to change. However, what was heartening was that apparently the plan that they submitted the most recent plan that was submitted was rejected by the Secretary of State, and they were told to go back and bring it up to date. So maybe there's a little hope there, but Mass Save has been a big disappointment. But I also wanted to state, we're having a heat pump installed actually in the next few weeks. And on a $21,000 heat pump installation, we're getting $6,000 back from the state.
that's great.
And that's upfront.
That's very good.
Mhm.
That is quite a lot. Scanning through here to look for more raised hands. Am
I think
missing
Dave has one.
anybody? Dave, okay, there's, oh, the big yellow hand.
I never run out of questions.
I know, great. Okay.
I think
Dave.
this is why you wanted me to come, Dave. Is just
Yeah.
to ask
Just so
questions.
you can answer all my questions.
Answers, he wants answers.
I'm curious if you can tell us what teeth the next generation legislation has. In other words, what incentive is in place so we actually do meet the milestones? Is there like some fine or something that happens? Like, why do they care if they meet these milestones or not?
Yeah, it's a great question. There is not an incentive specifically to meet any of these milestones. I think it's very similar to the Global Warming Solutions Act. I think the only incentive is political, which shouldn't be discounted. If people are not, and the one good thing about having 5-year goals as opposed to 10-year goals is that when you don't meet a 5-year goal, you have more ability to correct ship and say, oh, we haven't met the 5-year goal. Everyone's mad at me as governor, me as a legislative leader, we haven't met this goal, and it becomes a focus and things can happen. So that is in the theoretical sense, the main way that this legislation can be implemented. There is some ability, I think we've seen this under the past bill, the Global Warming Solutions Act from 2008, for outside groups to sue for parts of the bill to be implemented better. I will say that there's a little bit also here with, now that climate is included within the DPU, if DPU is making decisions about utilities, and that's the Department of Public Utilities that now has climate change as its mandate for the first time, if it's making things or decisions that are so inconsiderate of climate impacts or climate aspects, outside groups again can sue. So right now, the only ways that this bill can be implemented is through either external litigation, suing and so forth. And that could also be internal, like the Attorney General or someone suing as well, but that's less likely, or through political pressure as well. And I think this is one of the fundamental issues with some of the goals is I think, it's a big political achievement to get goals like this passed, and not to discount them at all. But it's worth noting that without some kind of backing behind them, it does not amount to much beyond a piece of paper and a political promise. And the people who pass them today and make the promise that they're going to reach them today may not be the same people who were in the legislature in the future. I mean, it's the Massachusetts legislature, people there a long time, so maybe that's not the case. But even with that said, it's not necessarily the same people who are going to be there 10, 20, 30 years down the road when we're hitting our 2050 goals or not. So unfortunately, there isn't a lot of teeth. And that's part of where the Green Future Cap comes in, because the price on carbon that the Green Future Act creates is not one that just says, hey, we're going to get $20 a ton or $40 a ton. It's actually set so that if the state doesn't meet its climate goals, the reaction is that the price would change. not by a ton, but by enough to get to those goals. And the good thing about that is that, let's say the state is doing great in other areas, meeting its climate goals for 2040. And let's also say that technology globally, and obviously stuff that we use here in Massachusetts, has now gotten so good that we're able to reduce our emissions a lot. If we don't need a carbon price, none will be implemented that year. But if the state isn't reaching its goals of 2030, 2040, 2050, then the way the Green Future Act is set up is then the price will reflect how much you need to get to that goal. So that, in a sense, that is some teeth there. And if politicians don't want that price to move up or not, they need to make sure they're making progress elsewhere. The good thing there is it actually means that you're also raising more or less money depending on how much you need it. So hopefully that answers your question. I guess short is that no, there really isn't that much teeth, but we probably should have some. It's hard to hold the government accountable with the government. So
Yeah. So if someone does decide to sue because they're not getting implemented, like you said, I'm not exactly sure what that means. Like, do we send someone to jail? Like, do they get impeached? So like, what does it mean to sue someone?
Yeah. So in this case, when lawsuits externally come regarding policy, a good example of this is the Boston Harbor cleanup. The state was supposed to meet certain requirements of the Clean Water Act that was passed federally, I think, in the 70s. It didn't do so. So it was sued by external partners, the state and the city of Boston, for not having the Charles River be clean, for not having the Boston Harbor be clean. And then what the reaction to that was the government was required to create plans and implement plans under the order of a judge to meet certain requirements to clean up that river and clean up the bay. So what it is it's a lawsuit that's brought that then leads to a judge mandating using existing powers the government has to achieve those goals. Usually lawsuits are successful when, and this is starting to stray outside my area, but my understanding is that lawsuits are primarily successful when the government has a mandate to do something and the ability to do so and is not fulfilling it. And so then an external piece of litigation can come forward and say, you haven't done this, here's the thing that you should be doing, and then make sure that you do it, usually long-term plans and so forth. So in this case, what that would most likely look like is, right now the state has the ability to enter into a carbon price tomorrow. That's why the governor can talk about TCI without having to pass a bill. But this bill does is it requires a carbon price to be entered into. So if this Green Future Act doesn't pass and we're not meeting our climate goals and someone is successful in bringing lawsuits through this, then one possibility, and this is approaching the edge of my legal understanding overall because there's tons of aspects here. One possibility is that you end up with a judge ordering a carbon price in order to achieve that goal. So if you're not meeting your 2030, 2040 goal, you have the ability to have a carbon price, you're not using it, you're compelled to do so. And the issue with that is that you're not doing so in a way that's democratic, where the legislature and the people have the ability to talk about it. And you're not doing a carbon price in a proactive way. So you're not doing it in a way that creates jobs or invests in critical infrastructure. You're using it as a reaction to something. So it's possibly more regressive. It's not as good. So that's one possibility, is that you end up with some kind of bad carbon price in the future or something else. So I think Dave has his hands up. I think you might be.
Okay. A question about the carbon prices. Right now, the Massachusetts Audubon Society sells carbon credits for all its land that it has in Massachusetts that it keeps trees and whatnot on. Are we going to be able to do similar things with Chelmsford open space in this legislation?
Yeah, so this legislation does not talk about carbon credits as much as carbon pricing. But the way to think about the difference between the two of them, although they're very similar, is that carbon pricing is taking the cost of fossil fuels and making sure that they're usually higher to reflect the full cost of everything. So that can be through kind of a specific tax on the carbon price, on the fossil fuels it's entering, or some kind of like requirement to buy a permit that essentially makes the cost a little bit bigger. Where you're talking about a little bit with Mass Audubon or other communities, and I've seen this done in a lot of different places, phenomenal, is finding, let's say like 100 acres of forest or an acre of forest and saying, none of these trees can be cut down. And then calculating using the most accurate science to say, these trees are 5 feet tall now. In in 100 years are going to be 10 feet tall. That amount of growth is going to suck in through photosynthesis and whatnot 100 tons of carbon. So hey, if we don't cut these trees down, we're going to create 100 tons of carbon times however many trees there are. And I'm just kind of making these numbers up, so don't take them as word. And so then what you can do is say you can raise money off that. So that's more what it is. It's a little bit different because you actually don't even need this bill to do that. So if Chelmsford had a forest that is potentially going to be cut down, Chelmsford can work, and might be a good thing to focus on with your net zero committee, is look for open space that can be preserved, and then you can work with an external party in order to essentially make money off of preserving that, because you can sell to people who need to offset their carbon somewhere. Say, hey, look, I'm building a house, it's 90% carbon efficient, it still creates like 10% emissions. I need to buy some offsets so I can get to zero. Oh, well, I can buy these offsets from Chelmsford, and now they're preserving a tree somewhere that helps offset that. That's what that is. You don't even need this bill to do that, frankly. And
but if we're trying to make our communities net zero, could we offset our municipal buildings with maintaining so many open spaces?
You hypothetically could. And I think it would depend on how you define meeting net zero at the local level, and also how you usually work with an external validator to validate that, yeah, actually there are trees here, yes, they're actually being preserved, and so forth. So there's a town, I think it was West Springfield, Mass Audubon might know more. There's a town in Massachusetts that does that now, that has been able to create offsets. They create credits and sell them on the open market. You could just as easily keep them in town, which honestly might even be cooler. So I would definitely check out, if actually at Mass Audubon, Sam Anderson, I think, is now over there. He's the legislative director. A few other people. He actually used to work for Senator Barrett, fun fact. And yeah, so I would reach out to them because they may know the other towns that have that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's a super interesting part of this. I mean, I think one of the climate action team here, that there's a million different ways to deal with climate, and that it interacts with the environment in so many different ways as it is like.
Boy. Any other questions, comments? Vern, I haven't heard. Tom's got his hand raised. Okay, Tom.
Hey, Tom.
Well, I have a personal experience, and it's kind of my pet thing that I'm really, really gung-ho on residential solar. And I mean, it can't hurt helping us meet our goals for, increasing clean energy. But I've been very, very disappointed when I tried to add solar panels at my house, that I ran into the archaic and restriction of a 10K limit for net metering. And there is a current bill that Patricia Haddad has called H3319, that just asks to increase the limit. And yet, I mean, to me, that's really low-hanging fruit. It shouldn't take months, years, etc. If this bill has any credibility, why should we have to do a lot of activism, so to speak, to just get things like that changed immediately? So that people, we hear a lot about environmental justice and help, not making sure low-income people aren't hurt. But what about helping people of means who really want to do the most they can, and then run into these kind of restrictions and limits and bureaucratic BS, so to speak? It's very, very frustrating.
Yeah. I have a good friend in Plymouth who they've been trying to get solar in their home, and there's a local bylaw that prevents it because of it's a condo association. It's super frustrating.
Yeah.
I think part of it is, I mean, from a political perspective, it's a couple of 1,000 people across the state, probably more if we're being honest, want to do something and are annoyed by it, but only one or two of them are Tom and know about how to make the change. And so it's part of this, it's an issue for a lot of people, but they don't know how to communicate yet. But with that said, that doesn't mean it's impossible. One of the things, the good thing I'll say is that with the thing the legislature does a lot is it doesn't just take one bill and pass and say that was our bill. What it will do is it will take one bill and move it forward, and then a ton of bills will just kind of tack it almost like fleas or something. A ton of bills will attach to it and then pass with it. And these are called omnibus bills. It's when you have more than one topic within kind of a issue, so the issue of climate together. So the bills in 2016 and 2018 were omnibus bills. And the one that is passed, the next generation roadmap bill, and you saw those smaller things, there's even more smaller things relating to solar at the local level that were added on as well. And so the good thing is that if a bill like the Green Future Act moves forward, it will never look like how we just talked about it. It will be dissected, things will be added, and likely one of the things that will be added is small things like that. So, even if this bill moves forward, as long as you and Representative Haddad, who I know is super good, and actually Haddad got a lot of things into the last bill for what it's worth. Though I'm sure she's not listening, but she got a lot of things into that bill. So the good thing is that you're more likely than not, especially if it's continuing to be an issue, which it seems to be, that it will be included into that. So I always say, I always talk about these big bills and presentations like this, and they're important, just as important as these small things. And the good thing is that they get kind of stuck together later. So.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's a good question. This is a great. I love this. This group knows what they're talking about. Love it. Not saying that other groups don't, but
I know it is a good group. I'm learning a little bit more each time and getting more and more confused about other things. But
that's me every single day. That's me every single day, Kathy.
I'm just glad I'm with a bunch of other people who understand it. I don't know what we'd do without each other. Dave Drayton, you have a question? I love Dave's question.
Yeah. Sorry, and just stop me if I'm asking too many questions. I just do that. So one of the things I keep running into when, for example, when I had a Mass Save guy at my house, and I was talking to him about heat pumps, and he said I should absolutely not get a heat pump, just because his main reason was because electricity is so expensive in Massachusetts. So the way he put it was, it'll be burning electricity super efficiently, but it'll be like burning $5 bills instead of $1 bills. And so I'm curious if in the past legislation, or if in the proposed legislation, if there's anything in there that'll help decrease the price of electricity to help make electric equipment like a heat pump more cost competitive.
Yeah, there's nothing kind of specific, but what is, I think, the like overall thing involved here is that when you think about like those three sectors we talked about before, the electric sector is one, and that's what we're talking about here. But then the transportation and the heating sector. The interesting thing is that the way to get those to be decarbonized is actually to electrify them, and that's the only way to do it. Is essentially make cars run on electricity. Make sure that as much public transit is running on electricity. Make sure that heat pumps, which use electricity, are added to the grid. The thing that does is that increases demand for electricity. And actually, this is one of the reasons that utilities in general really kind of like, especially if they have big business stakes with electricity, really like electrification of these two other sectors, is because it increases the demand for their product. I think overall, one of the kind of larger theories involved, not just in Massachusetts, but in general, is that the more things that are added to the grid, the more that the cost will go down. Because a higher demand means the more, infrastructure that needs to be done to bring it to the end consumer. Similarly, the more solar and offshore wind you can add to the grid also helps to decrease its cost overall. So I think in the long run, one of the kind of overriding economic theories is that increased demand for the electric grid, matched, of course, with increasing supply, from public utilities and whatnot. Because the thing to note is that the electric grid is not regulated by the market as much as it is by state government. And as increased demand comes, more resources will come on board with it. That plus solar and wind and stuff like that is likely to decrease the cost. And that's pretty much, that is kind of what we've been seeing recently. But
okay, so what I'm hearing is upgrading the grid, so we can deliver electricity more efficiently.
Mm.
And
It is worth, like, the one thing with short-term costs that's worth noting is, you never know if, right now a lot of our grid and a lot of the electricity that we use does come from burning natural gas. And so unless we're getting off of natural gas, we're going to end up being constrained by the fact that so much of our electric grid is reliant on gas in the short run. So in the short run, the costs may increase, they may decrease, but in the long run, as we start to move towards more away from fossil fuels, the costs are predicted to decrease. Again, this is, I'm straying into my prediction thing that I shouldn't be making in predictions, but I think Jack had his hand up. So, and I also want to be conscious of the library.
Yeah, I know. I just looked at the clock. We have, how about we have Jack and Bern had his hand up, and then I think we may need to end before they shut us down. Jack?
Yeah, and I'm also just before Jack jumps on, I'm just going to put in my email if you want to ask me other questions. And the last thing too, in case we have to be kicked off, is if this group is interested in helping with the next generation climate bill, definitely check it out. We'd love your endorsement of it. Yeah, reach out to me or Carrie or whoever. Happy to talk about that. But Jack, you were the next, I think.
Yeah, just a quick point, and that is you hit the nail on the head when you talked about infrastructure. And it gets back to the fact that people tend not to think about systems approaches to things. And so if we convince everybody in Massachusetts to go out and get an electric car, they'd have no way of powering them because there are almost no charging stations in Massachusetts.
Sure.
Plus, as the point that I think Dave raised was that the cost of electricity in Massachusetts is fairly high. So the question that I would have is, how do you begin to connect the dots so that people see that there's a clear connection between what they want and what they can get and what they can do? So that would be a question for me, and I'll talk to you offline about that.
Yeah, of course, I'd love you. You have my email. Now my email's on the chat.
I'll save
if you
it.
shoot me an email, we can go back and forth. So
Okay.
And I just put your website back in there too. Bern, I know you've got your hand raised there.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what Dave said, that the cost of electricity is so high in Massachusetts. But we have municipal electrical companies in Massachusetts. In particular, we have friends in Stowe, and their price of electricity is half of what we pay here. And so the environment is the same. They have to deal with the same problems that the National Grid or Eversource folks have to do. But there's a huge disparity between what they can do and what National Grid does. And so I'm not an economist, and you are, maybe you know the answer, but it seems to me that we pay high prices for part of the reason we pay high prices is because we're used to it. And I'd like to know how we can break that cycle.
So I think with wider energy economics, it's approaching the point where I'll be pure speculation and not as useful as not. But I think the note of optimism on that is that there are a lot of people who are thinking about that in a number of different ways. And I think one of the things I'm constantly hearing from people who are energy economists is that the issue is that there's not as much attention on this issue, first off. And the second thing is that there's not as many resources at the state level to be able to provide the alternative to fossil fuels. So those are the two things I constantly hear. And I'd speculate that if we were trying to break the cycle, what we need to be doing is trying to invest more in clean alternatives as opposed to fossil fuels. So back to the example of mass save, we need to not be investing in dirty kind of fossil fuel infrastructure when we have alternatives like heat pumps. And I know Carol mentioned this, you got a great deal on the heat pump there, but we got to make sure we get even better of a deal for individuals so that those things can be baked in the long run. So I'd say that probably the best way to do it, to nudge us out of that cycle, is to provide more resources. And what we can do as individuals, as citizens, is continue to make this a top issue. I think Chelmsford, I think not everyone hears from Chelmsford, but you have 4 state reps. If you're not already constantly contacting them about stuff like this, you definitely should. They sure that people might get annoyed, but it is their job at the end of the day to be responsive to us as citizens. So, and you'd be surprised how, having 4 people reach out to a state rep is extremely, extremely important and way more impactful than you think. So some of these things are so much above any of our ability to articulate, but I think if we continue to push those principles of a cleaner economy, I think that's what we got to do. So,
Well, I think we probably should get to
Yeah.
the end now because it's after 8:30. But I do want to thank you so much, Tim, for coming and giving us all your time and covering these very complicated issues. And I want to thank everybody here in the audience who came to listen to Tim. And just to remind you, if you have, I'm already on our mailing list, please send a note through our website to get on the mailing list for Chelmsford Climate Action Team. And check out Tim's website and maybe subscribe to his e-newsletter that he does, some great information.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you all. This has been a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Keep up the good fight, everyone. Thank you all. Thank you to the library and everyone.
Yes,
love the
definitely.
questions.
Thanks to the library.
Thanks a lot, Tim.
Thank you.
Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tim.
See ya.
Thank you.